Some men spend their whole lives building something solid, a career, a reputation, a quiet dignity that carries them through the hard years and into the peaceful ones. And then, late in life, when the walls are finally down and the heart is finally open, they hand it all to the wrong person. Ptolemy Hayes was a retired doctor from Cambridge, 73 years old, a man who had spent decades reading symptoms, diagnosing problems, following the evidence. A man trained to see what others missed. He missed everything. This is his story, and it starts, as so many of them do, with a woman who knew exactly what kind of man she was looking at. I remember the exact moment she told me about her family's house. We were sitting on the terrace of a small restaurant in Cebu, the kind of place with rattan chairs and overhead fans that barely moved the hot air. The sun was going down, painting the water this deep shade of orange that I'd never seen anywhere in England, and Mara Santos was sitting across from me, in a yellow dress, stirring the ice in her drink with a straw, looking out at the harbor like she owned it. "My family had a beautiful home," she said quietly. Not dramatic, just matter of fact, like she was describing something she'd accepted long ago. In the hills above the city, 5 bedrooms, a swimming pool. We had 3 house staff. I watched her face. She wasn't performing grief. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just talking, the way someone does when they're sharing something that still hurts, but they've learned to carry it. "What happened?" I asked. She turned to look at me, and for a moment she didn't say anything. Then she smiled. That small, careful smile she had, that made her look like she was deciding how much to trust you. "My father made bad investments," she said. "After he died, we found out there were debts. Large ones. The house had to go. My mother moved into a small apartment in Mandaue. My brother dropped out of university. We lost everything in about 18 months. I remember reaching across the table and putting my hand over hers. I didn't say anything. I just sat there and let the weight of what she'd told me settle. That was the beginning of everything. I need to tell you who I was when I arrived in the Philippines, so you understand why I believed her. I wasn't some lonely old fool who'd never been anywhere. I was a retired physician. I'd practiced internal medicine at Addenbrooke's for 31 years. I'd raised 2 children, survived a marriage that ended quietly and without drama when I was 62, and then spent the next decade doing what I thought was the sensible thing, traveling, reading, keeping myself useful through locum work, and trying not to feel the particular emptiness that comes when the structure of a working life disappears. My son William lived in Edinburgh with his family. My daughter Patricia was in Toronto. We spoke regularly but carefully, in the way that families do when they love each other, but don't quite know how to say it anymore. They had their lives. I had my solitude. I'd come to the Philippines for the first time 2 years before I met Mara. A colleague from my Addenbrooke's days, a man named Frederick Ashworth, who'd retired to Dumaguete, had been telling me for years that I needed to see Southeast Asia. "It'll change your perspective, Ptolemy," he kept saying. "Everything slows down. You'll breathe differently." He was right. The first trip was 2 weeks, Cebu, Bohol, Manila, and I came home lighter than I'd felt in years. The warmth, the color, the friendliness of people, the pace of life that asked nothing urgent of you. I went back 6 months later, and then again after that. I was in Cebu on my 4th visit when I met Mara, a mutual acquaintance, a Filipino woman named Conching, who ran the guest house where I always stayed, introduced us at a small birthday dinner. Mara was 28. She was studying, or so I understood, at a university in the city, taking a business administration course. She was bright, attentive, and had a way of asking questions that made you feel like your answers genuinely mattered to her. I was not looking for romance. I want to be clear about that. I was 71 years old. The thought of being with a woman that young felt absurd to me. But she kept appearing. At Conching's, at the coffee place near the guest house where I liked to sit in the mornings. She had a natural ease about her that I found disarming, and she was curious about my work in medicine in a way that felt genuine rather than flattering. We talked about health systems in developing countries, about public versus private care, about what she called the dignity gap. the way wealthy patients and poor patients were treated differently in the same hospital. She was articulate and passionate, and I found myself looking forward to those conversations more than I wanted to admit. "You're not what I expected," she told me one afternoon, over coffee. "Most Western men who come here, they're not interested in ideas. They just want to be comfortable. And you're not what I expected either," I said. "Most people don't want to talk about health policy over breakfast." She laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and unguarded. I remember thinking, this woman has a genuine mind. And that was probably the moment I started to lower my guard. The relationship developed slowly. Too slowly for a fraud, I told myself later. As if patience were proof of sincerity. We exchanged messages for months. I came back to Cebu specifically to see her. We walked along the waterfront, visited old churches, ate at markets. She never asked me for anything. Not once, in those early months, did she ask me for money. I thought that meant something. I thought it meant she was different. It was about 8 months in, on my 6th visit to the Philippines, that she finally told me about her family in any real detail. And that was the night on the terrace. The yellow dress, the stirring of ice, the quiet story about the house in the hills. "Do you still have any of the family's assets?" I asked. I wasn't being calculating. I was just curious, the way a doctor is trained to be, gathering information, building a picture. "A little," she said. "Some jewelry, some documents for land that my father owned in another province. But there are legal problems with it. My cousin Renato has been trying to recover it for years. It costs money every time he tries. Lawyers, filing fees. We've already spent more than we can afford." She shook her head. "I try not to think about it. It's not going to change anything. I think about that moment now, and I recognize what she did. She planted the seed and then walked away from it. She didn't press. She didn't ask. She just laid it there and let it sit in my mind, knowing I would return to it. And I did. 3 weeks after that dinner, I asked her about the land dispute. She seemed almost reluctant to discuss it. "It's complicated," she said, "and I don't want you to feel like I'm asking for help. That's not who I am." She said this with genuine discomfort in her voice. She looked at the floor. "I know you're not asking," I said. "I'm asking you. Tell me what's involved." She sighed. She told me the land was worth, in her estimation, several million pesos, a substantial sum that could restore her family's stability, help her mother live comfortably, put her brother back through school. But the legal process was costly. Documents had been lost. The case had dragged through the courts for years. They needed legal representation, filing fees, local government connections. "How much are we talking about?" I said. "Please," she said. "I don't want this conversation." "Mara, how much?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "To complete the case properly, according to Renato, maybe 1.5 million pesos, perhaps a little more. At the exchange rate at the time, that was roughly 22,000 pounds. For a retired hospital physician with a reasonable pension, a paid-off house in Cambridge, and modest savings accumulated over a lifetime, it was not a ruinous sum. I'd been careful with money my whole life. I had more than I would ever reasonably spend. I told her I would help." She cried. Not dramatically, just quietly, her eyes filling up, and she turned away like she was embarrassed to be seen. She said, "I can't accept this." I told her she wasn't accepting it. I was giving it freely, because I cared about her, and because helping someone you care about is not charity, it's decency. That was the first payment. I want to stop here and tell you about the version of Mara that existed in my mind at that point, because she was so vivid and so real to me that I can still see her clearly even now. The Mara I knew was dignified. She came from a family that had once been prosperous and educated. She was proud, sometimes too proud, almost to a fault. She was studying hard to rebuild something. She bore her family's misfortune with quiet grace, never complaining, never performing her suffering. She was, I believed, exactly the kind of woman who does not ask for help, even when she desperately needs it. that Mara was a perfect construction, and she had been built specifically for a man like me. After the first transfer, the relationship deepened. She came to visit me in England. I want you to understand what it means for a woman like that to come to Cambridge in November. Gray skies, cold rain, streets full of cyclists in waterproofs. None of the warmth and color she'd grown up in. She adapted gracefully. She was polite and curious, and made a genuine effort with my friends. I introduced her to Frederick when he came to visit, and to an old colleague of mine named Dr. Anthony Bream, who had me over for dinner. They both liked her. Anthony pulled me aside in the kitchen and said, "She's lovely, Ptolemy. Don't overthink it." I was not overthinking it. I was under-questioning it, which is a different problem entirely. She stayed 3 weeks. We talked about the future, about what a life might look like if we built one together. She was careful never to push. She never said, "I want to marry you," or "I want to stay in England." She simply described, in quiet conversations over dinner or on walks along the Cam, what she hoped for: a stable life, a family recovered, a path forward for her brother Crisanto. She talked about her mother Virgie, with a tenderness that moved me. She talked about what it had been like to watch her mother sell off pieces of jewelry, one by one, to pay rent. "She used to wear this ring," Mara said once, touching her own finger. "A sapphire. My father had it made for her in Hong Kong. She sold it 2 years ago for barely anything. I think about it sometimes. It felt like selling part of him. I thought about my own mother's rings, still in a box in my bedroom in Cambridge. The things we hold on to, the things grief makes precious. I believed every word, every single word." She returned to Cebu in December, and in January she called me. The land case had moved forward. There'd been a hearing, and the news was encouraging. But there was a problem. The opposing party had filed a counterclaim, and Renato said they needed a new legal strategy and additional documentation from a government records office in Manila. The cost had gone up. "How much?" I said. A pause. Then, 3 million pesos. That was approximately 42,000 pounds. I sat with it for a day. I asked a few questions. She answered them carefully, and she always had something: a document name, a court reference number, a detail that sounded credible. I transferred the money. Looking back now, I understand that she was good at what she did because she understood how a certain kind of man processes information. I spent my entire career reading symptoms, weighing probabilities, making diagnostic decisions, and she understood, or someone had coached her well enough to understand, that a man like me responds to specificity. Give me a court reference number, and I feel anchored. Give me a legal term I recognize, and my guard drops an inch. Give me something that sounds like evidence, and I stop asking questions. The payments continued. Not all at once, not in a great rush. They came gradually, over the course of about 14 months, spaced in a way that felt natural rather than systematic. Legal fees, government levies, a payment to secure access to archived documents, a bribe, she called it a facilitation fee, to a records official in Cebu. Emergency funds when Virgie was hospitalized for what Mara described as a cardiovascular episode. Money for Crisanto's university re-enrollment, when the original funds had apparently been consumed by administrative back payments. Each time she was reluctant. Each time I pressed her. Each time she accepted with a gratitude that seemed almost painful, as if the accepting itself cost her something. By the time 14 months had passed, I had transferred a total of 375,000 pounds. I want to say that number again. 375,000 pounds. Over the course of my lifetime, I had saved carefully, lived within my means, paid off a 4-bedroom house in Cambridge, and accumulated what I considered a comfortable retirement fund. And I had given more than half of it, more truthfully than I'd ever admitted to myself, to a woman I had known for under 2 years. My pension covered my living costs. I told myself the capital was just sitting there. I told myself it was helping someone. I told myself a lot of things. There were red flags. I see them now with a clarity that is almost painful. Let me name them. The first one, I never met Virgie. Despite multiple visits to Cebu, despite the fact that Mara spoke about her mother constantly, with love, with worry, with what felt like genuine devotion, I never once sat in a room with the woman. There was always a reason. Virgie was unwell. Virgie was not feeling up to company. Virgie was visiting relatives in another province. Once, Mara arranged for us to stop by the apartment where Virgie lived, and when we arrived, Mara went upstairs, came back down 5 minutes later, and said her mother was having a difficult day and couldn't see anyone. I accepted this. A doctor who understood how illness affects dignity, who understood that not everyone wants to be seen when they are unwell. I accepted this completely. The second, Renato, her cousin, the lawyer managing the land case, was someone I communicated with exactly twice, both times through brief written messages forwarded by Mara, which she said came from his office. I asked at one point if I could speak with him directly. He doesn't speak much English, Mara said, and he's very formal. He would find it strange, me giving his number to a foreigner. She said this with a small, embarrassed smile. Filipino lawyers are not like British ones. They don't like clients to bypass the family. I accepted this too. The third, I never saw a single court document. I asked, more than once, for something formal, a case number, a written update from Renato's office, anything with a letterhead. Mara always had an explanation. Documents were in Tagalog or Bisaya. The court system was not digitalized. Papers had been mislaid. Once, she produced a photograph on her phone of what appeared to be a legal filing, in Filipino, and showed it to me briefly before the screen went dark. There, she said. That's the motion they filed. I couldn't read it. I didn't push. I accepted all of it. The fourth, she never introduced me to anyone from her real life. I met people around her, Conching, various friends, a woman named Prissy who seemed to be her closest friend, but none of them ever referenced the wealthy family history. None of them mentioned the house in the hills. None of them talked about the Virgie I knew from Mara's stories, the dignified woman who wore sapphire rings and had managed household staff. When I mentioned these things to Pressy once, in passing, during a moment when Mara had stepped away, Pressy looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not surprise exactly, more like a careful blankness. I didn't ask her what that expression meant. I should have. The moment everything changed came from an unexpected direction. My son William called me in February, about 18 months after I'd first started transferring money. We didn't speak often about finances. It was not that kind of relationship. But he had noticed, during a conversation about estate planning, that certain figures didn't add up to what I'd described in the past. Dad, he said carefully, I'm not trying to pry, but you mentioned last year that your savings were around X. And the number you're giving me now is significantly different. Is everything all right? I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, I've been supporting someone, a project, a legal matter in the Philippines. There was a long silence. How much? He said. I told him. Another silence. And then, very quietly, Dad, I think you need to be careful. I told him I was fine. I told him I knew what I was doing. I was slightly irritated, to be honest. The particular irritation of a man who has spent his life being competent and does not enjoy the implication that he might not be. We ended the call in a civil but strained way, and I sat for a while in my study in Cambridge, feeling certain that William simply didn't understand. But something shifted after that call. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But something. A small, quiet part of me that had been asking questions I'd refused to hear began to make itself audible again. I called Mara that evening. I asked her, as gently as I could, whether there was any progress on the land documents, any timeline she could give me. Renato says maybe another 3 months, she said. 3 months, I repeated. I know, she said. I know it feels long, but these things take time in the Philippines. The system is very slow, and there are people who need to be persuaded. I've been hearing 3 months for over a year, I said. A beat. I know, she said again. I'm sorry. I hate asking you to wait. I hate that this is taking so long. But we're close, Ptolemy. I promise you we're close. I wanted to believe that. God help me. Even then I wanted to believe it. But I made a decision that night. Not to confront her. Not to accuse her of anything. Just to find out, quietly, what was actually true. I had a contact in Manila, a Filipino physician named Dr. Ruel Macalinao, whom I'd met at a medical conference in Singapore several years earlier. We had stayed in loose touch, exchanging the occasional email. I wrote to him, carefully, explaining that I was trying to verify some information about a family in Cebu, and asking if he knew anyone who could assist discreetly. He was kind and practical. He connected me with a woman in Cebu named Gloria Pinto, who ran a small firm that handled background checks and civil record searches for business clients. I hired her without telling Mara. What Gloria found took her 11 days, and she presented it to me in a concise written report that I read 3 times before the words fully settled. The Santos family had no history of significant property ownership in Cebu or any surrounding province. There was no record of a large family home in the hills. There was no active land dispute case in the Cebu court system bearing any variation of the Santos name in the context Mara had described. A man named Renato Santos did exist. He was a third cousin of Mara's, but he was not a lawyer. He worked as a motorcycle parts dealer in Mandaue. Mara's mother, Virgie Santos, was alive and appeared to be in reasonable health. She lived in a small but functional home in a modest residential area in northern Cebu. Not a cramped apartment, but nothing consistent with the story of a family that had fallen from prosperity. The family had never been wealthy. I sat with that report for 2 days before I called her. I didn't sleep well those 2 days. I kept running over everything. Every conversation, every detail she'd given me, every moment where I'd had a question and chosen not to ask it. I thought about the yellow dress and the stirring ice. I thought about Virgie's sapphire ring, sold for almost nothing. I thought about Crisanto's university fees, and the cardiovascular scare, and Renato's untranslatable court motions. I thought about William's voice on the phone. "Dad, I think you need to be careful," and the irritation I'd felt at being treated like I might not know what I was doing. I had not known what I was doing. I was sitting in my study when I called her. It was late afternoon in Cambridge, early evening in Cebu. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and easy, the way it always was. "Ptolemy, how are you?" "I'm all right," I said. "I need to ask you something." "Of course. I've had some inquiries made," I said, "about your family's history, about the land case." Silence. "Mara." "What kind of inquiries?" she said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was still there, but something had shifted underneath it, the way the surface of water changes when something moves below. "I hired someone in Cebu to look into the court records," I said, "and the property history." Another silence, longer this time. "I see," she said. "There's no land case," I said. "There's no record of your family owning significant property. Renato is not a lawyer. Nothing. Mara, I need you to talk to me." When she spoke again, her voice was quiet, not defensive, not angry. Quiet in a way I hadn't heard from her before, a different kind of quiet, stripped of performance. "I was going to tell you," she said. I let that sit. "When?" I said. "When I had enough to give some of it back." "Were you going to give it back?" She didn't answer. I said, "Tell me the truth. Not about the money. I need to know, was any of it real? Was any of what we had real?" Another long pause. And then she said, "I cared about you. I want you to know that. What I felt for you was not nothing, but you were lying to me from the beginning." "The story," she said. "The story about the family. Yes, that wasn't true, but I didn't expect to. I didn't plan for everything to become what it became." "You planned enough of it," I said. She went quiet again. I asked her one more question. "Did Pressy know? You from the beginning?" A very short pause. She knew there was no land case. She didn't know how much you'd given me. I thought about that careful blankness on Precy's face when I'd mentioned the family stories. The blankness of someone who knew the truth and had decided not to be the one to say it. I'm going to end this call now, I said. Ptolemy, I'm going to end this call, and I'm not going to contact you again, and I would like you not to contact me. She said my name once more. I ended the call. I sat in my study for a very long time after that. Outside the window, it was gray in that particular Cambridge way. Low clouds, bare trees, the occasional bicycle passing on the road. A world that looked exactly as it always had, completely indifferent to the fact that I had just done something irreversible to my own financial future. I told William that evening. He came down from Edinburgh the following weekend, and we had the most honest conversation we'd had in years, sitting at my kitchen table over tea that went cold while we talked. He was not unkind. He didn't say I told you so, though he could have. He just sat there and listened, and at the end he said, "Right, so let's figure out where things actually stand." I also called Patricia in Toronto. She was harder. She went through the anger that William had bypassed, the fear beneath the anger really, the terror that her elderly father had been systematically stripped of the financial security she'd imagined for him. "Dad, £375,000. Do you understand what that is?" "Yes," I told her. I understood what it was. I had written every check. I understood exactly what it was. I thought about trying to recover some of it. Gloria Pinto told me that recovery in cases like mine was possible in theory, but extremely difficult in practice. The money had been transferred voluntarily. I'd sent it in good faith. The legal mechanisms available to me across international jurisdictions were expensive, slow, and uncertain. William consulted a solicitor in London who specialized in cross-border fraud. The prognosis was not encouraging. The cost of pursuit might well exceed any realistic recovery. I made the decision not to pursue it legally. That was hard. But I also knew, and this is the doctor in me, the part that has always tried to be honest about prognosis, that I could spend the next several years of my life in a legal process that consumed my remaining energy and returned nothing. I was 73. I had a pension. I had a house. I had enough to live on. The life I had imagined was diminished, but it was not gone. Frederick, my old colleague in Dumaguete, called when he heard through the grapevine that something had happened. He was tactful about it. "Come back," he said. "Not to find someone new. Just to come back. Don't let it take the place from you." I thought about that for weeks. There's something I want to say about Mara that is difficult to say, because it risks sounding like I'm excusing her, and I'm not. What she did was a calculated deception that she maintained over more than a year, and that cost me a significant portion of my financial security. She constructed a false history, sustained it with detail and patience, and used my professional instinct toward evidence as a tool against me. She is not innocent. She chose to do this, and she did it deliberately. But I have also spent enough time as a physician to know that people who do things like this are rarely simply evil in the uncomplicated way we sometimes wish they were. She was 28 years old, from a family that was not wealthy and had never been wealthy, living in a city where the gap between what was possible and what was accessible was enormous. I don't know who first suggested the story, or whether she built it herself. I don't know how much of what she said about her feelings was genuine and how much was performance. I suspect she herself might not be entirely sure. That complexity doesn't forgive anything, but it makes her human, which is worse in some ways than if she'd been simply monstrous. What I'm clearer about is my own part in it. I was a man who had spent a lifetime being analytical and careful, who had arrived in a beautiful country feeling lonely and quietly desperate for connection, and who had found someone who seemed to answer something in me that I hadn't fully admitted was missing. And in that state, I had abandoned the very habits of mind that had served me for 31 years in medicine. I had not followed the evidence. I had followed the feeling. There are things I know now that I should have known then. You do not send large sums of money to resolve legal disputes you cannot independently verify. You meet a partner's family early, and if there is always a reason why you can't, that reason is the thing you need to examine. You do not mistake reluctance to ask for money as proof of integrity, because someone who knows they are going to ask will always begin by appearing not to, and you do not interpret your own emotional investment as evidence that the object of that investment is trustworthy. These are not complicated lessons. They are the lessons of someone who has been taken apart and put back together, missing a few pieces. I did go back to the Philippines. About 8 months after I ended the call with Mara, I flew to Dumaguete and spent 3 weeks with Frederick. We walked in the mornings, ate well, sat on his veranda in the evenings with beer and the occasional rum, and talked in the way that old friends who've known each other for 40 years can talk. Honestly, without the need to manage each other. "Do you regret coming here?" he asked me one evening. "To the Philippines, I mean. The first time." I thought about it properly. "No," I said, "I don't. I regret the specific choices I made, but no, I don't regret coming." "Good," he said, "because the country didn't do this to you. One person did." He was right, of course. And that distinction mattered more than I'd expected it to. I still think about the terrace, the yellow dress, the way she looked out at the harbor with an expression of quiet acceptance that I read as authenticity, and that was, in fact, very precisely crafted for a man who needed to believe he was being trusted with something real. I think about the things I believed: the house in the hills, Virgie's sapphire ring, the land documents in a courthouse in Cebu that never existed. Renato, the motorcycle parts dealer, turned into a lawyer in my minds, because she said the word and I didn't check. I think about what it cost me, not just the money, though the money was significant, but the time, the emotional energy, the version of the future I had been quietly, carefully building in my imagination, a second chapter of some kind, something warm and unexpected in the later years of a life that had been full, but often solitary. That version of the future is gone. I'm not sure what replaces it yet. But I'm 73 years old, and I'm still standing, and that is something. I have a great niece who started her A-levels this year. She wants to study medicine. She came to visit me in Cambridge in the autumn, and we talked for hours about the NHS, about diagnostic reasoning, about the way you learn to hold uncertainty while still making decisions. She is sharp and earnest, and reminds me of the young doctor I once was, the one who believed that if you gathered enough evidence and thought carefully enough, you could usually find the truth. "What's the hardest thing about being a doctor?" she asked me. I thought about it for a moment, and I said knowing when your own feelings are distorting what you're seeing, because they always do, sometimes. And the dangerous moment is not when you're wrong, it's when you're wrong and you feel absolutely certain you're right. She nodded like she was filing it away, and I thought, yes, that's the lesson. It took me 73 years and 375,000 pounds to say it that cleanly. I'm not going to pretend the money doesn't matter. It matters. I've had to recalibrate what my later years look like in a practical sense. I've had conversations with my accountant and my children that I would have preferred not to have. I've made adjustments that are real and will be felt for whatever years I have left. But I'm still here. I still take my walks along the Cam in the mornings. I still have Frederick sending me photographs from Dumaguete with a message that just says, "This view." I still have William's children, who visited at Christmas and filled the house with noise and chaos in a way that made me feel, for 3 days, absolutely present in my own life. The wound is there. I don't think it will fully heal. But it has stopped controlling me, and that is a different kind of health than I've been looking for. Quieter, less dramatic, more honest than the second chance I thought I'd found on a terrace in Cebu. Some things cannot be recovered. The money is gone. The version of myself that crossed that ocean believing he'd found something real. That version is gone too. What's left is something simpler. A man who knows, finally and fully, the difference between evidence and hope, and who will never again confuse one for the other. That, I suppose, is worth knowing. Even now. Even at this cost.